Well, I'm back with my colleague, Rose Gottemoeller, not just a current colleague, but a very old friend.
Indeed.
We go back a long ways.
Yes.
So Rose was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, as well as holding many senior posts in the State Department and other government agencies, but she's now here with us at Stanford. So Rose, you just did a piece in the FT and then in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist thinking about a negotiated settlement for Ukraine.
Right.
And this is obviously going to be one of the things that will be early on Trump's foreign policy agenda. He's
Yes.
claimed that he could settle this in 24 hours. In fact, he could settle it even before he became president. I think obviously there's a fear on the Ukrainian part that what that means is that he'll simply cut them off and force them to capitulate. But you have a different opinion about what Trump's incentives are. So maybe we could just go around to at least the three major players. So that would be President Trump, President Putin, and President Zelensky, and how you see their interests and incentives as you approach. I mean, we don't even have a negotiation, but
Right.
If we were to have one, what those would be.
All right. Very good, Frank, and thank you for having me on again. It's always a great conversation. So my view is, if there's anything we know about Donald Trump, it's that he hates to be a loser. He does not want to be a loser. But up to this point, Vladimir Putin has considered this upcoming negotiation to be very much the victor's negotiation, a zero-sum negotiation
Right.
in which he absolutely defeats Ukraine, NATO, and the United States of America under Joe Biden. He has wanted a winner-take-all approach, zero-sum. I'm coming out of this the absolute victor. But that is not an attitude that's going to be a winning one with Donald Trump. And so if Putin wants to negotiate with Trump on any number of things, he's going to have to start thinking about how to switch to more of a win-win approach. And for Mr. Trump, I think it's incumbent on him to be thinking now about what kinds of concessions he asks from Mr. Putin. I think in any negotiation there have to be concessions, and it's time to think what will work with Mr. Putin and how to move forward the negotiations on that basis. As far as President Zelensky is concerned, coming out of this in some kind of win-win-win way obviously is best for him too. It will be a tricky set of talks, but clearly he needs to have his country survive as an independent sovereign nation with a future. And so those will be his top objectives, and figuring out how to square that circle will be tricky.
So our colleague Mike McFall just published a piece in Foreign Affairs in which he suggested that a solution might be basically a ceasefire, not a peace agreement, but just like the division of Germany or the division of Korea weren't actually peace settlements, but just temporary ceasefires that then became long-term divisions. But that the Ukrainians are at a point now where they might accept that de facto loss of 20% of their territory if they could get NATO membership. Now, I can see that from the Ukrainian standpoint. When I was there in September, a lot of our Ukrainian friends had got, the year previous they said, no, we're going to get back every inch of our territory. But now I think they're more realistic and they're willing to say, yes, if we could get NATO membership, we would stop the war. But that doesn't seem to be in Putin's interest. I mean, how do you judge that?
It's tricky here too, but I think it's possible to fashion a faith saver that Mr. Putin, he might swallow hard, but he could accept. Realistically, it always takes time for a country to enter into NATO. There are accession talks that go on. Sometimes they take years. It's a clear expression of what the Allies told Ukraine back in July at the Washington summit, that Ukraine is on an irreversible path toward NATO membership. So my view is, if you say we are not putting off NATO membership for Ukraine for an indefinite period, which was that was a view some Trump people put out, but instead saying that we have a negotiation going on that's going to stretch out for an indefinite period, but it will have an end, and you could even set an end out 10 years, 15 years. Oh, by the way, by that time, Mr. Putin's in his mid-80s, and he may still be in office, but
Yeah.
in any event, it's a different circumstance. So I link this up with the notion that the accession talks for European Union membership have already been launched. Ukraine and the European Union started sitting down last June on accession talks for the EU with hardly a peep out of the Kremlin.
Mhm.
And if you'll recollect, back in 2012, 2013, it was an association agreement with the European Union that apparently drove Putin in the direction of the first invasion of Ukraine,
Mhm.
seizing the territory in Crimea in 2014 after what he called a coup occurred in Ukraine, and a pro-Russian president was forced out of office. So, to make a long story short, I think the best way to do it is to marry up the accession talks of Ukraine with NATO and the European Union, to weave them together, so to say. And to be clear, it's going to take some time for Ukraine to get through all the phases. But nevertheless, it would be on an irreversible path to membership in both European institutions.
Yeah, of course, from Ukraine's standpoint, anything less than a full membership is really not going to be sufficient, at least not at the present moment, because they feel that they've been told this kind of thing before, and, you know, unless you actually have Article 5, they can't really depend on the Europeans and the Americans coming back to help them.
Right. Well, Ukraine's going to have to be realistic, because NATO membership does not occur in an instant, no matter what. I mean, NATO could say today, yes, we want Ukraine in, we are inviting you in. They have said, we want Ukraine in. We are inviting you in right now, but still, it would take some time for it to get through the accession phase, even with countries that are so clearly democratic, settled economies. They've dealt with corruption. Finland and Sweden, in the case of Sweden, it took a good 2 years for it to get into NATO. So it takes time. That's all there is to it. And so I think if Ukraine can be assured that it's in the process, that's really the most important thing.
Now, in Russia's case, even that scenario of an eventual Ukrainian entry into NATO is going to be a tough pill to swallow, given how much emphasis Putin has put on, the prospect of NATO membership driving him to do what he did. Do you really think that that's possible unless there's a dramatic increase in the cost of the war to him? Meaning, unless Trump is willing to actually escalate the amount of support that the United States gives Ukraine, so that it just becomes much more costly for the Russians to hang on?
Well, Putin turned Putin turned NATO into a bête noire here after the fact. He invaded Ukraine because he was looking to recreate a Slavic heartland, and Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia were the necessary pieces of that heartland. It's only as the war has gone on and NATO's assistance to Ukraine has escalated and elevated that he's turned NATO into a bête noire. I like to remind people that not so very long ago, at the Rome summit, well, it is a bit of a long time ago, 22 years now, 2002, it was Putin who actually signed up to the NATO-Russia Council and long-range cooperation between NATO and Russia. So Putin knows a different NATO and a different NATO-Russia relationship if he cares to remember it. And I can't say that NATO would be confident about re-entering into a relationship with Russia, but nevertheless, that history is there, and it conveys very clearly that NATO is not an offensive alliance, it's a defensive alliance.
Yeah.
So I think, honestly, what I believe would work in this case is a face saver for Mr. Putin, which is a longer period for accession for Ukraine. But in terms of assistance to Ukraine, I really think that the United States and the NATO allies should continue through this peace process, whatever it's going to be, really supplying Ukraine with all the assistance that it needs to continue to survive on the battlefield, and I would hope to make progress as well, but also what it needs in terms of its domestic economy and the support that the EU has been providing to Ukraine to ensure that its government can keep functioning. So there's going to be, and that's another thing Putin keeps saying, that all assistance must be cut off to Ukraine. That cannot be the way this negotiation unfolds. The assistance is going to have to continue. And even if Mr. Trump pulls back, NATO allies in Europe have been doing their best to put together the resources that they can continue to assist Ukraine. This big example of that is this 50 billion euro loan that they have extended to Ukraine, again, for domestic reasons to support the government. But it's based on the frozen Russian assets. The interest earned on those assets is the guarantee for the loan. So I know the Europeans are thinking in every way they can about continuing the support, no matter what Mr. Trump does.
One of the things in your article that you mentioned that I hadn't realized is the number of NATO allies that have actually met the 2% demand in terms of their defense spending. How many is that out of the total?
It's 23 out of 32 now,
Yeah,
and that's why I keep saying Mr. Trump is going to meet up with a much different NATO than he encountered when he first came to headquarters in May 2017. I remember that occasion vividly. It was a dreadful day. He shocked the allies up one side and down the other by saying, if you don't pay up, we, the United States, are not going to live up to our Article 5 commitment to you. And that was a shock to the system at the time. But in some ways, Jens Stoltenberg, who was then the Secretary General, and I, as his deputy, we thought these messages were really necessary because at that time only 3 out of then 27 allies had stepped up to their 2% commitment. Only 3. And they had agreed in 2014 that they were going to head in that direction and be there by 2024. So Jens and I could see that they were failing to meet that commitment. And so Mr. Trump jolted the allies, got them to pay attention, got them to begin to put more money into their defenses, and then the second jolt came from Vladimir Putin's aggression against Ukraine. That really pushed the boundaries of what they'd been willing to spend earlier. So now many NATO allies consider 2% of GDP not a ceiling but a floor, and are talking about going farther. You hear that from the Balts, you hear that from Poland. They're ready to go farther.
Yeah. By the way, one concern is not just with current levels of spending, but future ones. I mean, the defense industrial base in both Europe and in the United States has really atrophied since the Cold War. And I don't see anybody really making big investments in developing the capability to surge further if that became necessary. And unfortunately, it seems to me that that's the kind of world that we are moving into.
It's been a tough message, particularly for the Europeans, because not only have they allowed their defense industries to atrophy over time, but they are split among all the NATO countries, with a number of countries having, their own tank program, for example, without proper regard for interoperability and standards in the NATO alliance. So that's something we struggled with in NATO all the time, to try to get some consolidation in the defense industries in Europe. Again, the European Union is trying. They're trying to push that and to push ahead also with the modernization, not only of the defense industrial base in terms of the production lines, but also in terms of acquisition policy and how states go about acquiring large amounts of military equipment. So there's a lot going on in Europe, but I also will say it's forced, I think, a real reconsideration of the future of U.S. defense industries as well, and we're going to be seeing a lot more innovation in that arena, and it may be led, very interestingly, by what's going on in Ukraine. Ukraine is establishing its defense industry now in a way.
The drone industry is unbelievable. Yeah.
In a way that is quite innovative, and I think could lead the way for other NATO countries, including the United States, in thinking through what's needed for the future of defense manufacturing.
Now, I don't want to end on too much of a downer note, but it does seem to me that there really is a leadership vacuum right now in Europe itself, because I don't know, it seems to me Macron is kind of a goner in the long run.
Well, he can't serve much longer anyway.
Yeah, and in any event, he just had a prime minister go through a vote of no confidence. German government is basically
It's fallen as well.
It's fallen, and it's going to take several months until they actually have a new government. Now, hopefully, the Christian Democrats will be able to cobble together some kind of coalition, but they're also being chipped away at. We've got not just Hungary, but now you've got Slovakia that is very questionable. We just had Zuzana Čapitová, the former president, the liberal president, and she was telling us some pretty scary stories about, the way that government has been undermining, the bureaucracy. And I would imagine that there's also going to be some very interesting intelligence sharing issues that are going to come up, particularly if Tulsi Gabbard becomes the DNI. As I understand it, you already have big problems with Austria, with Hungary, that a lot of information, people are not willing to share all that readily because they're too worried about their connections with Moscow, and then maybe we'll have something like that in the United States itself.
I hope not, but yeah, that's a worry. It's clearly a worry. Well, let me make a couple of points about that. First of all, I do think that other countries are stepping forward in Europe now. Inside NATO, the big four, the Quad, as we called them, were always the UK, the US, France, and Germany, and they led the way. But now other countries are stepping forward, like Poland, for example, and Poland has its own governance problems. But nevertheless, they seemed very willing to take a strong leadership role. And I think we may see a renewed leadership coming perhaps from some unexpected directions, like Turkey, for example, which, of course, Erdogan is another one of those leaders who were concerned about his autocratic tendencies. But on the other hand, within NATO, the Turks are well regarded for their operational chops, that they are always ready to step forward and put up their hand for military operations, and very, very professional as well. So, and I do believe that Turkey and Mr. Erdogan are going to play a role in this peace settlement in Ukraine. So I think leadership will be coming from different directions. Am I worried about what's going on in France and Germany? Of course I am, but I think one other point I'll make is I think the leadership in the European Union under Ursula von der Leyen, as well as in NATO under the new Secretary General Mark Rutte, there will be some islands of stability and I think strong leadership as well. So we'll just have to see how we get through this period. It's not going to be easy.
Okay, well,
fasten your seatbelt.
From your lips to God's ear, let's hope that there actually is a negotiation and that we don't abandon NATO. I think that's probably the most hopeful speculation you've made, and it does seem to me there's a certain logic there. So, Rose Gottemoeller, thank you very much for talking again, and we will see how this all plays out.
Yes, exactly. You want to make any bets about where we'll be this time next year?
No, absolutely not.
All right. Anyway, thank you, Frank. Glad to be with you.
Okay, thanks, Rose.